Magic. Love it or hate it, it's in our tabletop games. I'm certain y'all are gonna look at this and expect Magic to be like Pathfinder 1 or Dungeons and Dragons, but to those who think that, get your fine keister in that chair and listen up. Pathfinder and 3.5 OGL Magic is, complicated. Certain classes can learn most or all their spell list and prepare them to each spell slot or prepare them to cast as their slots allow. Those classes can only know a few spells but can cast them as they will, as long as they have slots available. Magic and Starfinder can work can work either way, but at base, it works as the latter one. With the book Galactic Magic, they also have prepared casting option, which I've actually never looked into. Hold on, let me read this part of the book. Looks like it's 3.5 Wizard. Okay. But there's also another table saying they can only prepare a specific number of spells. So I'll have to figure this one out on a later date. But with the core rulebook, you can learn a number of spells, change those spells whenever you level up. Let's talk about how that spell casting works. Now, before you cast a spell, you need to talk to your GM, your game master, about how it's done. With how the rules in the book are written, there's no verbal, somatic, or material components in standard spells, rituals, or otherwise, but we're not talking about rituals. I say, personally, it all depends on the spell. Command, I say, you need to say the command, obviously, while some spells need at least one hand to direct it, like caustic projection. But keep in mind there is one thing stated about all Magic and Starfinder. Nobody can hide the fact that they're casting a spell. If you cast a spell, everyone around you knows you're trying to cast a spell. When you cast a spell, you actually don't roll. In the vast majority of cases, you will not roll jack in order to make the spell go off. Instead, you'll look your game master in the eye and say, I'm casting Mystic's Thrust against this enemy. Roll a will save. Of course, the GM will then ask what you're rolling against them, and you'll say, oh, I don't roll. You do. Most spells in Starfinder are save or suck spells. The only ones that aren't are those that actively say how they're cast. For example, Weapon Surge says you put the spell into the weapon and you roll a ranged attack, while some other ones say a melee attack with specific weapons. Now, how I go about it, I never actually figured out if it's how it's supposed to work, but I've always stated that with the spells that require to be put into a weapon, you roll the spell damage on top of the weapon damage. But that's just how I go about it. Now, spells don't work in 5e, or don't work like 5e, where there's upcasting. You do not upcast. Instead, you actually downcast a spell. You will notice some spells have multiple levels. 6 levels, in fact. There's only 6 spell levels. And you will notice that each one does something different. You don't take the lowest one and boost it up. Instead, you take the highest one, replace any previous spell level versions you've taken with a spell at the appropriate level, and you can actually decide, yeah, I want to cast this spell at its level or below. For example, Mind Thrust, one of the most powerful spells we'll talk about later, it can go up to 6th level. You can take it at, or when you get 6th level spells, and then you can cast it at 1 through 6. If that makes any sense to you, I'm trying my hardest here. So that's your basic rundown of magic in Starfinder. Let's go into classes. There are 4 caster classes at the time of making this video, though most classes have magic-ish subclass, though they usually aren't half-casters. I suppose you could argue that the Solarian is a caster, but according to the rules, it's not. Their powers are pure psychic and solar energy, though psychics are magic, but not exactly? Anywho, let's go through the alphabet with this. Let's start with the Mystic. They gain connection into something, whether they get that connection through faith or through pure emotion. Their magic comes from their emotions, basically. Though you can actually shoot all that in the foot if you want. You can choose to not take a connection and instead take epiphanies. With epiphanies, you can build a class that's much more customizable. Essentially, your mystic at that point is looking inward and finding a connection within themselves in their heart and soul. This normally gets forgotten by Paizo, though I think there's only like 2 mainline books and probably some adventure paths as well that have epiphanies in them. Mystics can have 2 overpowered spells, and those are Mystic Thrust and Mystic Cure. Mystic Thrust can break a game for both NPCs and players that have it. Mystic Cure is stupid powerful healing spell that only heals hit points, not stamina. But with a certain feat, you can actually use it against undead to break them. But for every good spell, there's terrible ones. Augury. Seriously, I don't understand why anyone take a spell that tells you, is this action good or evil? Like, how much of a psycho are you if you don't know if something is a good or evil action? There's definitely others as well, but that's my opinion. Let's move on to precogs. Precogs are time wizards. They see a moment in the future or past that changes them psychologically, making them act odd, to say the least. Sometimes they become social outcasts because they know everyone around them will be dead soon, or because they know there's a better result they could be in. Their abilities work off their bodies, specifically their dexterity modifier, but their spellcasting is based off their intelligence modifier. They are the only class that gets multiple options for starting weapons. As in, at level 1, they can choose if they want to be proficient with advanced melee weapons, long arms, or sniper weapons. Their subclasses are their anchors, what event they saw from the future or past, which also changes their abilities to pull and pluck from other timelines, allowing them to pull into results they desire. With their anchor, they can change not only their own and enemy skills, attacks, and some damage points, but their saves and initiative rolls too. Their temporal anomalies are their choice abilities they get at most even levels, allowing them to look into alternate timelines to learn just everything. The temporal anomalies can teach them how to use their paradoxes, their basically portents from 5th edition, in different ways, and can also allow them to pull from other knowledges as well, teaching them all the weapons they could have. Their spells are very time-based, weirdly enough, almost to a detrimental point, because it sort of makes them look and feel like they're pseudo-time lords, you know? But let's look at their best and worst spells. Best, in my opinion, might not seem like really the best to most people. Death's Door. At various levels, it'll deal damage and reduce strength and dexterity, making some enemies absolutely worthless, which in turn makes it incredibly powerful. Don't overlook this spell. Its name implies one thing, but it does something else. and it's very good to torture. What's a Prekov's worst spell? Locate Hive. It requires you to be familiar with a place, and you can always find that place, knowing its direction and distance. This is a setting that has high-tech GPS and star navigation. There's at least 3 subclasses and various different classes, from casters and marshals, who know how to do this without a spell slot. So it's really got no point to it. Now we go into Technomancer, a rather odd class in this list, as it's one of 2, arguably 3, who don't have a subclass system out of the book they came from. They use arcane powers and scientific knowledge to bend the physical world at their will. In some follow-up books, you can change your abilities to give them a drone, a magic teacher, or a few other things. It's honestly the simplest caster, and probably the best to learn the magic system. At level 2, they can start taking magic hacks, which allow them to combine their magical and scientific knowledge to manipulate the field. They can get a quick idea of what's on a computer or travel through a computer link system. At later levels, they can sacrifice spell slots to gain another spell slot in another level. The Junk Technomancer is a kind they got later on, I guess arguably a subclass, but not exactly. A guy on a trash planet that learned how to use broken parts around him to protect and serve in his survival. Great for a Mad Max sort of game, and there's also an archetype that fuses with it so deliciously. The Technomancer has a lot of good spells, but there are only a few really great or bad spells. They're almost all okay, though not great. In my opinion, there's one great one though, and that's Supercharged Weapon. While it's one of the few spells in the game that requires a ranged attack, it deals a good amount of damage, which I admit I add on top of the weapon's normal damage. I might be doing that wrong though, I admit that. As for worse, those of you who know D&D are gonna call me a heretic. Magic Missile. It shoots 2 missiles that each deal 1d4 plus 1 damage, which are guaranteed to hit, and it shoots a total of 3 missiles if you take a full round action to cast the spell. There are no higher versions of it, no scaling with caster level, nothing. Sure, it's going to hit, but it's going to fall heavily behind your own gun. Now we go on to the last caster, the Witch Warper, a magic man that doesn't pull from time, physical, or emotion, but reality itself. It also doesn't have subclasses in its base book, but the base ability is, probably the worst of them. It manipulates the ground around them, or a ground in the area, in a 10-foot radius to essentially give difficult terrain plus some, depending on the spell slot sacrificed. I recommend looking into alternate class features or talking with your GM to try and build around the class, as it's not fun if something is just going to pull out a gun or not walk through the area. They get paradigm shifts that let them manipulate and pull from realities, calling alternate selves to give them a hand or similar. Their spells are based off of pulling from another reality where things are slightly different, and have actually led to kobolds in the Starfinder universe. Long story short, which I might go into in the future, but not today! With their abilities, Witch Warpers can essentially see different possibilities and use it in their advantage, gaining compound sight for some skills and alternate outcomes, which lets you reroll shit. Admittedly, this is strangely simple, but insanely complex, all in all. You've got one class with one subclass, and simple abilities that lead to 1,000 possibilities and 1,000 builds. Somehow. I don't know how, but I guess that's what happens when you're built around reality jumping. Do they have good spells? Do they have bad spells? Or just okay spells? Let's look through this list. In the latest book, Interstellar Species, they were given access to Mental Muscle, which is a great spell for the class. Allows the caster to use their casting stat to hit with weapons. Imagine a sorcerer using charisma to shoot a gun at a monster. But I think this spell is given to every caster class. Keep in mind, most spells go across multiple classes. But let's see the worst. Drift Prediction. This spell lets you see into realities and see the outcomes of your next drift travel, which is incredibly stupid given drift travel needs to lock onto drift beacons in order to work. I suppose this might be better after the drift crash event, ending in a month or two now, with drift lanes connecting vast to near space. But without that in mind, it's kinda just terrible. Magic and Starfinder can be a bit hit or miss. It's very good to teach a group about various systems of games, so I'll give it a medium of 65% on my rating list. Magic can make a game or break it entirely. It doesn't always outweigh the martials, especially with combat maneuvers, but it can completely shoot some things in the face, especially Mind Thrust. That spell is still the most overpowered. But that's what I have to say about Magic. It's a lot, so now that I've done it, I need to move on to the next thing. What will that be? Starships. So, now I'm going to space, and you can, well, shove off.